In this clip, we're going to modify the material and look of our particle system. So in the last clip, we had refined the behavior, and we're starting to see that it's looking like fire, but now's the time to begin working on the material to really start to tweak the fine details. So to get started with this, we're going to use a texture sheet for the animation of each particle. So let's go ahead and activate that. And then we need to apply the texture sheet to our renderer or our material. So in this case, you can see here that we are using the default particle material. And I really don't want to use the default. So what we need to do is we need to create a material for the fire. Let's go ahead and go into our, let's go to perhaps textures. And actually, we're going to need to bring in the files for this. I'll make sure that these are imported into the Unity package for this particular module. But let's go ahead and create a folder and import the asset. So I'm going to right click on the assets folder, create folder, and I'm going to call this effects. And then I'm actually going to import the folder for this. Okay, so I went ahead and I imported the effects that you can use and begin to experiment with. In this case, we're going to look at the fire effect folder. And in here, you'll see that I have a materials and textures folder. Now, the material that we want to create is the fire material. Now, I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new one right here inside of this materials folder along with you just to show you the steps. So let's right click and let's create a new material, and let's call this fire_alt. Now on this particular material, we need the shader to be using a particle effect shader. So let's go up to the shader, and let's go to particles, and here you'll see that we have an entire list of different shaders that we can use under the particles category. Now thinking about these particles, we want to think about how how textures overlay on top of one another. So if you think about Photoshop, some of these particular terms are going to be familiar to you. So let's say that with the fire effect, what we want to do is we want one particle with its fire texture on it. Whenever it overlays another, we want it to kind of intensify the color. Now to do that, we can use what's called the additive function for this. Okay, and we're going to use the additive shader. Now, if you look at some of these others, we have things like multiply. Multiply kind of allows an additive sort of format to this, but multiply really won't expand beyond the brightest value. So what I mean by that is if we have a hot yellow value on top of another hot yellow value with multiply, it's going to give us the exact same value. But what I want is I want it to intensify with that. And so it makes sense to use additive. So let's go ahead and use additive in this case. And it's waiting for us to set a texture for this particular material. So all we need to do is select the texture, and we're going to add the flame 4x4. So with the flame 4x4 in place, we're all ready to go. So we don't need to do anything else at this point. The only thing that we now need to do is apply it to our particle system. So let's select the particle system in the scene, and let's go back down to the render section, and let's left click and drag the fire alt on top of the default material here. So you'll see that that is now applied. Now you can see that we're getting that additive effect where one is over the other, and it's really intensifying the center of that texture image. Now there's one problem that we're seeing with this. It looks like a bunch of tiny little fires. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that it is actually animating through this texture atlas one by one. The really neat thing about this texture sheet animation is we can actually set up how many particular tiles there are from the texture itself. So looking at that texture, you can see that there are 4 in the X direction and 4 in the Y direction. And so now I can actually type in 4 by 4 and notice what it's doing. Each texture in that texture sheet is animating one full cycle across the lifetime of each particle. And so it's creating this randomness, this fire here. Now, this is looking pretty good. However, if you look at reference of a fire, you'll notice at the top it kind of points. It starts to lose its energy. Something like this would be like a flamethrower or something like that that is causing the energy to stay consistent out to the end, and then it begins to kind of spit outward. In this case, we're losing a lot of the energy once it comes off of the heat source itself. And so things should get a little bit smaller at the top. Now we can change that by going to the size over lifetime. So if I were to activate this and then expand it, you'll see that it does change it. However, this is now looking like fire is spewing out of a punctured hole in a gas line that has been ignited. And that's not really what I want. I actually want the opposite effect. And so I can change this by using this curve on the size. Now you can click on the curve itself and you can see it previewed here, and you can see that at the start of the life of the particle it's starting at a size of 0 and then it grows to the end of its lifetime. Now I want it to actually reverse that. Now I could select these handles or these tangents and then position it up here by left clicking and dragging, or what I could do is use these presets right here at the bottom. So I'm actually going to use this one right here to flip. Now you can see that all of the energy is starting right at the bottom and then it's tapering off at the top. Now looking at this with the material applied, I can see that the rotation, it's just not giving me the look that I want. And so I'm going to tone down the randomness of the rotation that we're giving it right off the bat. So let's go ahead and find that. I believe it was at the top. Yeah, so we have our start rotation. Let's go ahead and set this back to constant, and let's set it to 0. And then the randomness, we can just simply hit 0. It's not really going to change anything or modify anything because we don't have a random parameter above that in the start rotation. So here we can see that we're getting a consistent torch. Let's maybe add just a little bit of randomness to that, maybe between 0 and 10 degrees, just to make it a little bit more volatile. And then let's set this to 0.5. So you'll see that that's beginning to dance around just a little bit. We might even go 1 to allow each and every particle that comes out to randomize. Now I'm feeling pretty good about that. However, looking at it, if it was a really large fire for a particle system, I would be a little bit more concerned and probably put a little bit more time into it. However, because this is going to be a small torch, I think this really fits for what we're looking for, and especially if it's from the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to take this particle system and I'm going to scale it down. So we can actually scale the physical particle system and make it smaller. And then we can move it into position. So I'm going to put this right up here with the lantern. And that feels pretty good. Now you could put it inside the lantern or maybe even a little bit above. I'll leave that totally up to you. I like it where it's kind of at the bottom of that lantern and it kind of pours out all the way through. So if you want to see the particle system emitting in the scene itself, it won't actually simulate unless you have it selected. And so if you want to see that, you'll want to maybe move your camera into a view and then just go into the game view. So there we have our particle system. Particle systems can be complex and you can create some really, really cool effects. But because particle systems are so different, it can be very difficult to go through every single parameter for every single scenario. So I would actually suggest that you experiment a lot with particle systems and think of something that you've seen in maybe a movie or maybe in another game and use that time as practice and learn from the fire itself. There's a lot to learn from here. Now you'll see that we do have a couple of different fire or different effects that you can use in this, and kind of take a look at how they were created and maybe get some ideas from that. So what we'll do is we'll copy this particle effect, and then we'll place that in our other lantern objects. And let me actually move that along the correct axis. And we will position that. So now that we've talked about particle systems, let's go ahead and move on to our next module.